All right, welcome back to UK Pro Muscle Podcast. Today, we've got a round table number 2. This is the progression from the last podcast that we did with John and Luke. And today we have another special guest, which you have already seen on the channel, Joe Jeffries. So the man needs no introduction, and neither does John and Luke. However, guys, before we start, you all get a chance to kind of plug yourself. And for those the people that haven't tuned into the last podcast, we will do a small introduction and a little bit of a plug at the beginning and the end of the podcast, as I do like to keep them at the start as well, as some people unfortunately don't last till the end. So I do like to keep them at both. But today, mainly want to talk about progression from the last podcast that we did talk about with mainly the safer use. Today will be the conversation of what you do next as an advanced competitive bodybuilder, such as myself, such as Luke, such as John, and what would be the next steps to take to still stay within the perimeter of being healthy and staying alive and still maximizing your progress, which is obviously the key here, as the conversations that we have been having across the board are mainly based around maximizing the progress while still keeping longevity and health intact, which in my opinion should always be a priority. And as John and Luke and Joe vouch for, it definitely should still stay at the forefront of our thinking when taking up the bodybuilding journey with the level that we do and wanting to actually stay in the game for, longer than a few years. That's what I like to say, so to speak. So guys, let's introduce yourselves, talk about yourselves, and then let's get stuck in.
Who's going first?
Who's going?
I'll go. I got it. All right, guys. So Luke Miller, No Switch Fitness here. I do a lot of educational content through J3U as well, as a J3U educator. And so that's kind of mainly where we're really active on the forums. A lot of John's content through the actual J3 University. We just released our applied hypertrophy model. And my thing is contest prep bodybuilders. I work strictly and solely with bodybuilders now. And so this is a topic that I'm very passionate about. Actually, I've had podcast conversations with Joe in the past before, so I'm really excited to get plugged in. It's just nice to kind of revisit and see where thought processes are as they develop over time.
Yeah, follow up on that. I'm John Jewett. Happy to be back. Thanks for having me. I guess you put up with me enough. Yes, just mainly working now through a lot of my education content through J3 University, just disseminating exactly what we're talking about today. And being that I am an enhanced bodybuilder at a high level, it comes to be like, well, how can I keep doing this for a few more years? And it's when I first started out, that kind of wasn't the thought process at hand. It's just like, get to your first show at all costs, right? And so the thought process changed along the way, and I had to learn all the whys behind what I do. And through all that, it's come to a knowledge set of being able to have some longevity in the sport, but not take away from the ability to compete at a very high level either. So that's what I've just been really passionate about sharing and educating. I just shared a post yesterday about at the Olympian meet and greet that people weren't coming up to me and be like, John, let me go see this amazing physique, right? Like, flex your arms. It wasn't even about that. It was about like, hey, John, this education content has like changed the way I coach or think about this, or as an athlete, it's impacted me this way. And that was, gave me this like greater sense of purpose. So really what I'm able to do here. So, oh, there it is. But like Luke said, he's now an educator on board with us, and we just released our applied hypertrophy model as well. So if you want to get more precise in your execution and get more out of every rep that you do, that is where to go for it. So I'm not doing much coaching. I haven't taken on any more clients at the moment. So just working on the education side.
So,
man,
let's go, Joe. Last but not least.
Hopefully, well, definitely least in muscularity, but hopefully not in brain power. My name is Joe Jeffrey, for those that don't know me. Firstly, Cuba, thank you for allowing me to join you and ramble again. So unlike these guys, like I said, I'm not a high-level bodybuilder, but I'd like to think I'm a pretty good coach of high-level bodybuilders. Male and female competitors are the large majority of my client base. I haven't taken on new clients for a while, just a few competitors here and there, because again, like these guys, my focus has shifted more so to the education side of things. So I'm the founder of Physique Collective, which is a website and an app. We primarily push the app now. We have specialists there for PEDs, which is what I take up the majority of the role. And we have posing coaches, mechanics specialists, we have neurochemistry specialists, basically every kind of facet of physique development, every nook and cranny that you could dig into that could possibly contribute. My goal was to put that on there. But the coolest thing about Physique Collective is the community. You know, Cuba, you would have seen this, how we have so many people keeping logs on there. And John, you would have seen it as well.
I'm in it. It's excellent.
Thank you guys, by the way, for contributing. It's absolutely epic when I see your names pop up on there. It's a bit of a, whoa, reality moment for me. But yeah, I absolutely love the community that's come out the back of Physique Collective. The most crazy thing is, like, I was just at 2 shows over the weekend. You see people in Physique Collective t-shirts, you think, man, what? It's so crazy. And so, yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Love it. Love it. That was an epic introduction from all. I will add all the links to all of the guys in case anyone wants to get in touch, etc. in the description, guys. So let's get stuck in. Let's start off where we kind of left off, maybe. John, do you want to kind of touch on a little bit of an overview of what we finished at in the last podcast? If you can remember, I know you've just done Olympia and you're just recovering. So if you can remember, if you've got the brain power, then you can go. If not, Luke can take over and kind of fill in. And then we can move forward from there. I think the biggest thing that I think got a lot of listeners engaged is more the smarter approach that is taken right now versus your typical bro science approach with, you know, a ton of harmful compounds that are just not warranted or needed with the approach that is taken now as well.
Yeah, so I think last time we were just starting off of, if you're just coming through this, where do you start from there? Like kind of that ideal situation, which that's never what I'm handed. Usually it's the guy coming with me that's already done XYZ, ABC compounds and high dosages. And it's like, well, where do you go now? So I know last time we were talking about, you know, start at why testosterone would be a base to start with, and elevating that up to a level where you can handle the amount of estradiol and DHT present as we want estradiol around, because it is a protective component. So once you're realizing all that you can get out of testosterone in that duration, that would be an escalation through another means of what you need out of this now on that individual basis. With with testosterone elevating, and like people ask, like, well, what does that look like on paper? And with estradiol elevating, usually you can have like higher anxiety levels, poor sleep starts dropping off, mood changes, libido changes. And a big one would be like probably blood pressure change. And then you can confirm in labs. So you got to have this marker of where you handle testosterone. And it's a good learning response too, right? So with something we can measure in a lab assay, saying, okay, you take this amount of testosterone, your labs are here, and you have that response built in. With other compounds, it's hard to assess that through like your lab work. So that's why, and it's a good learning means. But then as we need more muscle protein accretion, and we don't need the conversion of estrogen or DHT to manage those side effects, then we would introduce a compound that fits that criteria, which we had brought up using like a DHT derivative like primobolan or masteron, and those being choices that they're a little bit less benign than some of the other choices available. And they've been used in clinical human research before, but also deployed in females as the primary means of why they came about. And then we just elevate those dosages and as much as you need over the duration you need till we start seeing some type of detriment in performance, or holding performance or health detriments that brings about the question of like, do we need to pull back or should we push on? And that's like the assessment point from there. At some point, you're going to reach a high level where you will need to increase dosages to a risk model that's much higher. And you have to weigh out that criteria. I think that's kind of the point of where we left off. And I don't remember if we even touched on phase-dependent compounds deploying, and that might be where we're at as far as orals and Trimbolone 19 Nors and these other compounds that not stuff we probably want on year round, but maybe in certain phases. And I think through just testosterone primo masteron, where that will take you should be pretty far. You're past your first few years. And that's also not even talking about, we also have a multiple pathways to approach where you can use anabolics, but rather than smashing down it all with just one hammer of in that model, let's use multiple things that can have some synergy together and use low dosage of each rather than a high dose of just one. And so we talked about utilizing growth hormone, injectable L-carnitine, clenbuterol, telmisartan, metformin, insulin, all these means to stimulate growth before we're having to just escalate anabolic doses to this really high level. And so that's where we're at, and then reaching that intermediate to advanced level. Well, what comes next? How high do you go? Or and those conversations are now to be had.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point, and that's definitely where we left off. We didn't really touch any of that and did delve into any of the high risk stuff and all the other compounds. So I think that's definitely the way to go with that. Obviously, with all of us pretty much being coaches that do predominantly work with competitive athletes, I think this is definitely a great point to make within this conversation, as I think it's safe to say we've all made the silly mistakes of using the things that we shouldn't have used and take the approach of smashing the hammer through the wall, like John just said. And it did not end well. Well, it did, but could have been far better. So I think that the main thing that people do need to realize is they can get away with using certain less toxic drugs, so to speak, and a lot less of them in a different combination and get a much better result than doing what's currently more as a modern cycle, what I would describe it as, so to speak.
Just to bring this up, because I know people listen to this and they're going to think like, well, that's not me, right? I'm running these dosages. I don't have these issues. But the reality is a lot of us do. And this stuff just doesn't even talked about. Like my prep for turning pro was the heaviest I've ever used. And there's multiple issues that came up about it. Like when I was working at the hospital, they had a health screening to do, which is like 5 different measures. My HDL was less than 9. That's as low as the score went. It just said less than 9. Like, oh shit, this is really bad. My blood pressure was over 140/90. Like, oh, it was probably just the time they tested it, right? Some white coat syndrome. It's like, no, I was probably walking around with this high blood pressure, this single digit HDL. Like my lab work looked terrible. I felt fine being on prep, but it wasn't fine internally. And what is that time spent in that phase? Well, it could be pretty damaging over the long term, done years and years and years. Other issues, running Trenbolone way high. Hey, I've had lactation occur, and some people wouldn't even admit that, but that's just the truth. I want that transparency there. Or even after that prep, being on for like 35 weeks of high dosages, like libido function, that was like gone for 4 or 5 months, just ED, there was, and that took a long time to resolve. And so there's damage occurring at those dosages, stuff that's not talked about, that happened early on when I was just first started competing. I don't have that now. My labs stay good, my blood pressure stays good. I don't have these ED issues that result from high dosages over long durations.
To clarify, ED is erectile dysfunction, guys. So,
yeah.
So you guys that are struggling to get hard and your missus is complaining every time you try and get down and dirty and it's just not working, or you need a ton of salads to get it working. And we're probably talking about, some of these guys are probably watching right now and they're like, fuck, that's me. What do I do? So this is now where you want to put your seatbelt on, strap in, get your pen and paper out and start taking some notes to actually avoid, what we call the gym penis,
And that's the thing, is like you have these issues that are occurring. It's oxidative stress that's occurring and it's accumulating over time, and it's real acute right then. But or like, hey, my hair's starting to thin, or I'm getting more acne. Like all that is literally driven around oxidation, inflammation in the body. That affects all your organs, and a lot of these organs are concerned. And that's one thing, Joe, we were talking about last time was, and just like brain, kidneys, heart, testes, liver, all these organs, these are some long-term concerns for us to have. So like if we can address them as much as we can and be mindful, even if you're young gun, feeling like, hey, I'm feeling fine right now, that stuff's still occurring in the background, whether you notice it or not. But that's just something I want to touch on briefly, because it's like, hey, that's not me. It's like, it's only a matter of time of you're going to hit one of these things in the issue that's going to pop up.
Joe, you're up, guys. Let's go.
If I could just follow on from that, John, something that's potentially useful to the audience. I think there's, excuse the dogs walking past in the background. There's a lot of ethical chat within the PED educator world that leaves people potentially having a little bit more of a clue of the way that they should start to look at things, but no real direction of how to do so, right? So throwing out phrases like safer use model, or we should always get the most from the least and stuff. Okay, but how much is that? You know, you should probably use growth hormone and insulin rather than just smash androgens. Okay, but at what point of total androgen exposure do I do that? And with how much? You know, these people are really no better off. In fact, potentially worse by saying, right, I need to use a lot of drugs and then using a lot of drugs. So potentially something useful, if we put aside the caveat that biological individuality is great, if we say, right, for the statistically average person, which statistically most of us are, what are the kind of dosages that the higher levels are playing with, and what are intermediates playing with? And maybe you could speak for, if you don't mind, speak for kind of what you guys clients are doing, then I could give a reference to some of what my clients are doing, and then we can give people a framework, I think, of a realistic exposure of all of these drugs, not to aim towards, but to be aware of and be able to make rational decisions autonomously as an adult. Because I see this issue in consults, as people say, right, I know I need to use quite little, and I know that I should probably titrate up my testosterone, but to where and how much, and ultimately a lot of confusion. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I think everyone's always first to say on Instagram, especially, yeah, you should always use the least. And that's what we always see on the questions, you know, the questions and answers that people do all the time. You see the same answers every single time, but you don't actually see any specificity. So I think if we can cover a little bit of specificity with kind of a broad picture, just to give people an idea. And again, we'll kind of want to highlight, this is not us telling you to do this. It's not. This is basically for educational purposes to give people an idea of what is going out there and what could be a better option, rather than maybe doing, you know, a gram of test and a gram of EQ, which is quite popular. So I think that's what kind of people need to get in their minds, that is our goal here. Our goal is not to kind of tell you to do this. Our goal is to give you a good picture as to what is potentially done and what people are doing, and, you know, all different ways with it as well.
I think another good one is like, again, we throw out, right, we should use DHT derivatives potentially as the growth anchor, if not at least how to increase total milligrams of androgens. Something that comes up is, okay, but what's the stronger thing? So where do I go from there? That's really interesting to me, because I mean, everybody here knows that there is no good evidence-based proof that there is a stronger.
Primo's weak though. Primo's weak, bro.
Well, this is the cool thing, you know, because that, if you've ever had a look at Reddit, for example, this is something that still lives on today. The references to the Hirschberger assay and et cetera, et cetera. I'd like to think that we're all evidence-based coaches primarily. What good evidence do we have that anything else is more effective at the androgen receptor than anything else at transcribing anabolism? It doesn't get better, really, is what I'm trying to say. And I think that's where we need the clarity of, like, that there isn't some magic molecule at the androgen receptor that's driving some kind of big rammy level of androgenism or anabolism, sorry, and not androgenicity by that marker. It doesn't get better. So what does change? Dosage and individual response, really. And John, that leads into when you said, like, need specific deployment of drugs, potentially blending that into pathway specific deployment of drugs at the androgen receptor. It doesn't get better, so we can look at the next thing. And it's that simple. You won't need another thing. people chase the thing, don't they? The drug. No, it really doesn't get better than that. Maybe just this person responds better than you or takes more. And with more comes more risk, which then folds back to, okay, well, how much are they using then? You know? So that's potentially useful as well. If we could, John, go down that road of, okay, here's the estrogen receptor, here's the glucocorticoid receptor, here's the androgen receptor, here's the growth hormone receptor, here's what local IGF does, here's what insulin does, whatever. When you've got all of those things, you haven't got much else. You know?
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's a conversation me and Luke actually had on a podcast before. I think definitely with what Luke's been able to do with using far less and getting much more, I think it's definitely the case here where from my experience in past, using the stronger compounds did only make me feel like shit for one, and two, yes, I blow up with just a ton of water. So I think the biggest issue is the stronger compounds yield far more side effects. I think that's where the misconception comes from.
Yeah, I think there's also like, you get these people, and I'll see this as some sort of emotional attachment to some of these compounds just from previous usage with coaching. And then just walking them through that logic that Joe just kind of walked them through, and then possibly even sharing some of like the toxicity data, especially for things like Nandrolone, like some of the neurotoxicity data and things along those lines, can start to shift their mind frame and change their mindset and how we move about moving someone along the progression model. And I think we started to lay out about where would the Nandrolone inclusion be within like higher levels and considerations for that. And in most designs, it's going to be later within the progression design if utilized at all. And I think that's where we start to talk about like the progression model changing for advanced individuals in the rate at which the progressions are taken. Because if you're in the intermediate advanced stage or the intermediate advanced level, you should have a pretty good understanding of, you know, where's your test dose at, like how much test can you handle? Then where do we start to escalate stack design with the DHT derivatives? Obviously, inclusion of growth hormone and insulin is probably in play as well. And so what does that progression over time look like? And it's just typically a little bit of a faster progression up to the higher realms of dosing. And Joe, I don't know about you, I think somewhere in the realms of, you've said like 15 mg per kg, if I remember correctly, is probably like upper end of where you're progressing people. And so that's kind of where like you'll see somewhere in the realms of 3 to 5 mg per kg at the bottom, and then all the way up to that 15 mg per kg. And that's kind of where we start to lay out this progression model for intermediate advance, and then start to change the inclusion criteria based on the goal. So inclusion criteria being contest prep versus all season, and starting to make decisions upon that when we start to look at when we're deploying these different compounds.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want me to touch on the Nandrolone thing there, and then I can get you guys' opinion potentially?
Yeah, sure.
So to use the term Nandrolones loosely, maybe 90 norandrogens as a classification of molecules would be more accurate. Specifically, just talking about Nandrolone and Trenbolone. As synthetic progestins, I have a bit of a fear of, for lack of a better term, because neurotoxicity is my greatest concern with androgen use. I don't like the lack of data, it makes me very uncomfortable. I don't like the lack of acute ability to track damage with progestins. And I don't like the direction that the very early data is going when it comes to Alzheimer's and dementia risk with androgen exposure or with synthetic progestin exposure. So, but generally with that, my first thing would be, okay, let's absolutely minimize exposure, which seems obvious with any drug, but we don't do that in bodybuilding. So this is a definite, right, let's minimize this exposure. So what are they actually really good at? At the androgen receptor, as we've already elucidated, about the same thing. So if you're going to run a lot of Nandrolone, DECA, NPP, whatever you want to call it, versus a lot of primobolan, the protein accretion is roughly going to be about the same as of what it does at the androgen receptor. So forget it for that goal. And what Nandrolones are good at, Trenbolone specifically, is their high binding affinity for the glucocorticoid receptor. So the ability to eventually attenuate muscle protein breakdown via some degree of inhibition of cortisol to bind to the GR and do what it does there. So this could always be pretty useful. We're always trying to modulate protein turnover, right? So like even in a growth phase when muscle protein breakdown's fairly low, it would still be useful as an additional pathway, but the magnitude of benefit is going to be relatively low. So unless you really don't give a shit, then I would avoid the use of Trenbolone or Nandrolone in an off season, to be honest. Now, in a bodybuilder going through contest prep, and I say the word bodybuilder or competitive bodybuilder who has escalated amounts of muscle mass, because I consider the risk of actual protein loss in a deficit extremely low for the majority of people, for the massive majority of people. Even doing some kind of protein sparing modified fast for most people on an acute time period isn't going to risk actual skeletal muscle loss. So for a competitive bodybuilder, there's really digging to get the last vestige of body fat off. I think there's application at very low dosages. Like for my guys that have prepped this year, I'll just give you a number. I haven't exceeded 100 milligram for the most part. Scott, who just won the British finals, we did use 150 milligram for the last 2 weeks because I had to absolutely dig the life out of him. Cuba, you'll remember at the qualifiers, he was a little bit behind. Had to absolutely kill him.
Yeah.
But 150 milligram on someone that's now the class 2 British champion, you know, he's a lot bigger than 99.9% of people watching this podcast. And that's for 2 weeks. And we used 100 milligram before that. So that's the kind of way that I would frame Nandrolones use. Anybody else want to chime in on that?
Yeah. And like, I came across some interesting research because you're right, Joe, like we don't have great data on neurotoxicity in the brain long-term. And for one, the data we do have is usually these surrogate models in rats or rodents, because the ethical issue of like putting a current modern day human on super physiological dosages and let's see what happens over the next 30 years on their brain, we can't get that study approved. It's just too damn dangerous, right? So we're left with right. And so the issues that you might see occur from users from like 40 years ago aren't even at the dosage level that we see now, which is a scary thought as well. I did come across an interesting study looking at it was in neuronal cells, comparing the effects of testosterone, nandrolone, and dianabol. And what they do, they'd cause an exposure amount, certain dosage, and look at the oxidative damage on these neuronal cells, these brain cells. And they would block the actions of the androgen receptor or the glucocorticoid receptor, and impose that tissue with that steroid. So they would take an androgen receptor blocker, expose testosterone and nandrolone, and that would decrease the effects of the neuronal toxicity. The interesting one was nandrolone blocking the glucocorticoid receptor did not change the impact of the neurotoxicity or the progesterone receptor of what they used. It was mainly through the androgen receptor. Dianabol blocking the androgen receptor did not have an impact. Blocking the glucocorticoid receptor is what took away the effect of Dianabol on the brain toxicity. So it looked like Dianabol had more of this impact on the glucocorticoid receptor, which Trenbolone was in the study, but so does Trenbolone. The interesting one was Nandrolone was not in that same bucket of working on through the glucocorticoid receptor. It was mainly through the androgen receptor. So I feel like I've been lumping Nandrolone and Trenbolone probably too closely together. Likely in turn, maybe Trenbolone is definitely probably more neurotoxic, which that would limit where we really want to expose ourselves to. But Nandrolone potentially might not be quite as Trenbolone, but yet it's still very much dosage dependent and exposure duration dependent. But either way, all these drugs, and what I'd say is like at high dosages of androgens, you're going to have neurotoxicity. So with that being said, like deployment for nandrolone, it's I like Joe said, you can get a lot of protein accretion from the androgen receptor and the other receptor sites that these other compounds are going off of, because nandrolone has interaction with progesterone receptor, estrogen. They're all going to add some glucocorticoid receptor. Like those aren't going to be massive growth pathways for these compounds. It's mainly all mediated via androgen receptor. So why would we deploy nandrolone? And there might be I saw some data on like using nandrolone 100 milligrams a week added to a TRT regimen for joint and connective tissue integrity. Again, maybe it was just that they elevated the dosage and that was enough to increase some recovery. But again, I really think you can get a lot just out of using just the DHT derivatives and testosterone. So to give some context to that dosage wise, I think you need to know where your starting point is for a client or yourself, and what's that currently creating for that person, within also the variables being maximized. So if you have someone that's brand new, hey, I've been using 1,000 milligrams. Oh yeah, but your training sucks and your diet sucks. So you could probably go way back down. Let's break it down and then maximize those variables and elevate from there. Let me give you my own personal context and dosings and how I kind of titrate around to give you some idea. I prepped for a long ass time this past year. For my first show, my total milligram amount was 900 milligrams at the very tail end of prep. And I will say Trenbolone wise, it had gotten up to 150 milligrams. Of course, this was going to be the harder push for me because this was my first show. Once I hit that first show and I was already lean, I could bring food up. I wasn't having to dig deep and really push that high fatigue level and create that vast deficit anymore. So I actually tailored down the dosage all the way leading into this past Olympia. My milligram amount never rose above, I was at like 700 milligrams my last week, but all before that, it was a lot of at 600 milligrams. And that was no orals going into Olympia. I just only use injectables because every time I use an oral for every show, it didn't bring about much change that I needed, at least within my own self. The caveat within all this is that I am basically on prep, and what we're doing on prep is just maintaining tissue. So I've been able to titrate down throughout prep for what I need to titrate to just hold tissue, which if you're getting to a point on prep where you're like pushing food down lower and doing more cardio and your body weight still doesn't move, it's like, well, shit, you're probably holding muscle very, very well and training performance is holding. It's like, yeah, you could probably get away with, I don't even say get away with less, probably just could use less and do the same job and expose less risk. That's also why I was able to prep for like 30 weeks this year and keep my labs good. So that's where I'm coming to now from a tissue maintenance perspective in a contest prep was 600 milligrams of total gear. Post show, knowing that and moving to a phase where I have higher food, higher ability to generate good stimulus and output in training, I'm not going to need 600 milligrams. I'm going to move it down. So now I'm moving down to, it works out math-wise to be 280 milligrams of testosterone only per week. And I believe I can grow on this with the state that I'm in post-show. And that begins where I'm building out my own model of, okay, in prep, 600 milligrams was a spot to maintain tissue under very suboptimal conditions. I'll probably be titrating up quickly to that amount. And titrate up, what does that look like? Well, it's probably going to be for Primo, Masteron, 100 milligram additions per week, maybe 150 the first week, up to that 600 milligram mark. And then I typically would probably hold there, and I'm assessing what my performance increases are at that moment. If I'm constantly moving up in the gym and things are now progressing, I'll just continue and hold there until I require the need for more, and then monitoring lab work every 10 weeks and saying, how's this look? Health looks great. Performance is moving up. Excellent. Health looks great. Performance is starting to lower and stagnate. Well, I have aggressive goals of trying to get to the Olympia stage next year. time to increase dosage again and move that mark up with it can be another 100, 150 milligram increase until I'm reaching that point of probably a peak stress moment where I'm seeing health markers start to diminish. How long do I do that for? As long as I need to see out my goals and not see health diminish, which that might look like 20, 24 plus weeks, but it's also time frame dependent. So if I'm doing an Olympia, which is in 14 months, I might have to consider how much time I do want to be back on baseline, and realizing that time at baseline gear usage is going to be better for health. If not, I have to accept that risk of being in a higher risk situation but also am I a higher level competitor too. But then I have to plan on a prep and how long that would be extended for. So there has to be a little bit of, thinking ahead of what that might look like. So for myself in an off season, I've gone, before, like I've said, I've gone up above 2,000 milligrams. But I believe even for within myself, probably this off season, 1,000 milligrams of total anabolic would fit the bill of what I need. I don't probably see needing to go beyond that. Now, this is also with growth hormone being present throughout. 3 IUs is my baseline. I will move that up as other compounds are moving up along the way. I've never gone above 5 IUs ever. That's not to say that's not what bodybuilders do, because typically I see a lot of guys between the 4 to 8 IU mark. Going beyond 8 IUs, it's there. People are doing it. From what I've seen in practice, but also from guys that I talk to, going beyond the 8 IU mark, there seems to be that trade-off of benefit to risk and driving up a lot of blood pressure issues, a lot of water retention issues, and it seems to murky the water too, with assessing if you're putting on tissue or fat or water, but then also issues around blood glucose management and that's when you start seeing guys using a lot of insulin, and then it seems to really perturbate like visceral fat storages, and you're blowing out the waste, and that whole issue kind of compounds. So that was a long tangent of just kind of assessing my own, but I'm trying to give some feedback for people of how you would escalate throughout, basing your assessment off what you've previously done and moving forward from there.
That's definitely a great point. I think small point I'd like to make of how I structure things with advanced clients that come to me as well is the first thing I actually do, I strip them right back to just a 300 milligrams of total test, provided someone's somewhat advanced. So the first thing I would do is break down what they've done previously in past and basically start from scratch at just 300 milligrams for a period of minimum 6 to 8 weeks, and then take it from there. Because without a shadow of a doubt, anyone new that comes through, there's a number of issues that we need to get right first from a recovery standpoint, training standpoint, nutritional standpoint, and all these things contribute to them actually making progress whilst using probably less than they ever have in years. So I think that's definitely a good point. But as a reference, I think a lot of people are probably not going to believe what John just said. And we can, for all three of us, can actually vouch for John not actually talking a load of crap here, because we know for a fact we are going to get a lot of comments in them saying, what? That's all he used on the Olympia stage? That's bullshit. Believe me, guys, now that John has got no reason to lie or, mock things. That's genuinely what he does. And I think this should definitely show a lot of people what can be done with far less. It has me, for example. It has certainly pushed me to work towards going that way, as we all know. So I think definitely a valuable lesson from John's approach to learn. Luke, how do you approach things yourself? Because I know for a fact it probably will be similar because, again, we both know how you work, but I think a lot of people dismiss the amount of effort that can put into the training and nutrition and recovery and what they can get from just that alone.
Well, yeah, I think you're seeing that right now, right? Like, I think where people miss the boat is looking at each of these as vectors of progress, right? Like making sure that we utilize PEDs appropriately alongside the vectors of progress that we have within training and nutrition, and just catering that to where we take clients on. So like, for example, like with you, Kuba, being the post-show phase, that vector for nutrition and training is the largest that it ever is, right? And we talked about this on the previous podcast when we looked at like progressing my post-show stage phase. It's like I was at baseline, which was 40 mgs test EOD and 40 mgs mass EOD for 9 weeks post-show. And that was enough for me to take large progressions within the gym, within nutrition, within my physique, to a point where like I was performing at a very high level now. And then we could start to take the PED progressions from there. And then from there, it just looks like, kind of like John said, 100 to 150 mg progressions as needed to kind of move the scales up. And I believe I'd have to double check. My dose is at 80 mgs test EOD right now and 160 mgs of mass EOD. And so like I haven't even moved that far up the progression model. And we're a good 11 weeks into this push, if I remember correctly. Maybe not quite 11, but this model is meant to create progression across all variables. And I think when we start to look at it in that scope, we can now extend the runway of progress that we have with each level of PED usage. And I think that when we look at not believing John, because I know there's people out there that do, I've seen it on a couple different forums about them saying there's no fucking way. The reason that is capable is because of the level of standard that he holds himself with nutrition, with training execution and things along those lines. And this was like the first conversation, Kuba, you and I had when we kind of started, was like, hey man, you're a pro, you need to execute like a pro. And that's the kind of stuff, the conversations that we lead to. And I know the psychology of all three of us on here. It's like, we're going to bend over backwards to make sure that whatever we need to do happens. Right. And it's, that is the differentiating factor, is not leaning on PEDs. It's correctly utilizing PEDs as a tool, and why we start to map this model out. And mine doesn't differentiate too far from John's. I'd be surprised if I got over a gram during this all season push. And so that's kind of where, when we take people upon intake, it's a big reframing process. And a lot of times it requires hitting the reset button, kind of like you said, Kuba. It's pulling back, stripping back, finding what's wrong, fixing what's wrong. And 9 times out of 10, it's training, stimulus, or adherence to nutrition, right? And I'm going to say most of the time it's training. And that is kind of where we start to see the actual progress come on the table, rather than these large escalations and compounds.
Totally agree, man. It's almost like pressing a reset button and just like starting from scratch completely. And arguably, I think that's something that I've wanted to do myself, for sure. And definitely, I'll be taking even a better approach this year than I did last year. And I think that'll definitely yield far more results. So looking forward to share that one.
I would mention too, Luke came post show that like the heaviest body weight he's been at for the look and condition. Now you've reached a peak body weight that you'd never even touched. Yeah. And we're just getting started here, which is cool. To add on to that, and I think to give a good depiction, because early on, I would mask a lot of my poor management of other stress variables with more gear usage, and unknowingly so, why I'm in a position where I do use what I use, because now my and all of us, our lifestyle revolves around bodybuilding. We've built that for ourselves to where we can optimize every situation possible, with managing our perfect daily routines. Meals are hit right. Sleep is. We keep a low stress lifestyle. But back when I was working at the hospital, coaching on the side, having sleep move all around, I think of it as like a bucket of water. And every stress you have in your life, you're pouring some water into that bucket. And you have some recovery tools, and training being one of the things that we add into that stress bucket. Well, if at the end of the day, you got a fight with the wife and the job stress is building up, maybe you got poor sleep, your meals were off, you only have a little bit of stress to add into that bucket, with one being training. So you just have a little bit of stimulus you can give in the gym before that bucket overflows. Well, how do you let some water out of the bucket? Well, relaxation, great sleep, great nutrition, gear usage. So I would turn the knob up on gear to lower that water out of the bucket, raise my recovery ceiling, but still that's not what you want to do, because even that gear dial adds stress to the bucket. So to get the most, as I had to lower that bucket down, all the stress variables, manage relaxation, lower stress, get better sleep. And now my stimulus that I can add in the gym is vast. The output that I could get out of it, while needing just a little knob to turn up for gear for some extra recoverability. That's my stupid analogy, but I don't know if that might paint a picture at all. But yeah, I think Luke's points are excellent. And I think that's one of the big takeaways is we're managing all the other big important variables, and gear's in place now, just what it needs to be at.
I just imagined my stress bucket and a big bathtub being on top of it back in the day, and just like smashing it over. That was my stress bucket analogy, with literally a bathtub on top of it. But yeah, Joe, with the model that you mentioned earlier, I know Luke mentioned what you like to kind of bring the dosages up to within, the milligram per kilogram model. Do you want to touch on that a little bit? I think that's going to give the listeners a bit of a overview of how much people do and what they do, so to speak. Right. That's probably what everyone's waiting for. Like, yes, tell me now what to do, but not to do.
What's the max? Tell me the max.
50 milligram per kilogram. Let's go. I think the caveat is that milligram per kilogram model is not perfect at all. Plenty of flaws, as in any model, because unfortunately we have no clinically defined model of escalation of androgens for maximum muscle mass accrual. Just like John said, we're not being clinically evaluated and provided with these evidence-based functional titration methods that we can follow. But just to use it as a rough framework, because I generally use it as a point of analysis and assessment, which then leads to adjustment, right? My basically goal and what I come to with any client over time is that even under peak load, we will have perfect health markers, and I still staunchly believe that that's achievable with intelligent stack design. Like Cuba, for example, Joe Ballinger at the end of his last prep got him to get his blood work done. And I would say this because I'm his coach, but in my opinion, his best showings to date, the blood work was dead clean, not a single marker out on anything, including urinalysis, etc. Like, we had the blood lab do the full works, and it was perfect. So, that was under a third of his previous androgen exposure, but that's another topic.
He basically came off.
Well, he was, as compared to what he was doing, you could say that, yeah. So with milligram per kilogram, this is maybe where I somewhat differ from the way that you guys program. I have a degree of arbitrary macrocycle phase periodization, where I will marry up the training, the nutrition goals, and the PED accumulation within one macrocycle, but that macrocycle is open to auto-regulation as we progress through it. I just like there to be a clear-cut direction and landing point. For example, if we're in a growth phase and I say, okay, we're going to do 4 training blocks with a 4-to-1 accumulation to deload paradigm or something, we've got this 20-week block here, and this is our chance for growth. So our needs, on a needs analysis, we're going to probably require more total drug load, or at least it will be beneficial, that's for sure. And then after that, we're going into a maintenance block. So we're not going to require really any drug load there, like you were saying, John, the needs of an androgen in a maintenance phase. So I'll say, okay, let's plan to be at peak load by here, maybe just to use an arbitrary example for the last mesocycle. So for the last 5 weeks, we're going to ride peak load. And maybe up to that point, we're going to accumulate to peak load via androgens, growth hormone, insulin, whatever it may be. And if this is an individual that I've worked with for a long time, we will probably already know that peak load that individual requires on a needs analysis basis from previous data that we've collected through health marker tracking up to that point. Although a worthy mention is that there's a lot of deleterious effects of PEDs that can't be acutely tracked, things like blood work and stuff. Echocardiograms are pretty useful on an annual basis, but like the neurotoxicity element, who knows what's going on? But aside from that, I would have some arbitrary movement up. Let's say the first time we do this, it might land at 10 milligram per kilogram or something like this. And then we would track all the way along. We say, okay, well, we sort of added maybe 15 pounds in that time frame, with at least half of it being muscle when we dieted it off. And we just need to replicate that outcome so we could do that again. Or, okay, we needed a bit more than that. And the client says, I'm happy to take the additional risk. Maybe we'd go a bit further. But within that framework, I'd be very keen not to escalate over 15 because you have to put, I mean, for the listeners or watchers of this, you have to reference what 15 milligram per kilogram in somebody that's 130 kilograms is. You know, that's a higher level of androgens. And of course, this is very inter-individual dependent, but 15 milligram per kilogram for a 100 kilo person was still quite a bit, 1.5 gram. But, we're talking about escalating up to 2 gram, maybe a bit over 2 gram in larger people. It's a lot of drugs, but this is what these guys are doing. And it is also what some of these people will require. And it's also what some of these people will use regardless if you ask them to or not. So you have to make it as safe and practical as possible. And that's the kind of line that I would go down with the planning phase specifically, and an accumulation into a peak load and trying to frame it into what's realistic. Because I think it's all well and good saying, let's only accumulate up to 500 milligram or something. They're just not going to do it. And they'll probably end up leaving for somebody that's going to blast them with 6 gram if you don't get them the kind of return on investment that they want. So there's a few marrying in of factors there to pay attention to.
I think I'm definitely having a bit of a hard time trying to get people, especially certain individuals, trying to get them to understand that this is a method that will yield more progress. And this is exactly why I want to try and share as much of this off season as possible, because I think if they actually see me do it throughout this off season phase and be fully transparent and show them exactly how it goes, I think that's when a lot of people will be far more comfortable doing it. Even going through this prep, my Nandrolone dosage ended up at 210 milligrams. And a lot of the guys that I'm still trying to convince that there is a better way, you don't need to do 700 mg of tren, they're basically telling me shut up, mate.
You can't blame them, man.
So I'm like, dude, but I've done it. And they're like, so what? I'm still going to do that. And I'm like, okay, so you know what? This is why it makes me quite happy having you guys on and be able to share this, having you, Joe, having Luke, having so much experience and wealth of knowledge here. So hopefully some people actually listen to this and it actually gets through to them, because I'm not going to lie, gents, I'm still having a massive hard time with a lot of people that have either worked with years ago that are coming back on board or whatever. It's a battle. Today, I kid you not, guys, I've probably had a 30-minute conversation with one of my clients that I prepped in 2017. And honestly, it was hard, man. It was hard. I was like, what? We're not going to use any IIs. What? How am I going to get hard? We're not going to use any tren. How am I going to get hard? What do you mean? I'm like, dude, you don't get fucking hard for using an II. You don't get hard for using tren. If that was the case,
John.
The thing is not even John, though. It's if drugs made you hard, why is it natties are generally harder than anyone assisted?
Yeah.
It's body fat. Bringing body fat down makes you hard, not drugs. So let's get that on point. But
I think Joe made a good point too. We don't have clinical data that shows improved outcomes of an escalation model like this, right? And so I'll even get some clinically minded people that'll be like, well, how can you definitively state this, right? Because there's no clinical data evidence that explicitly shows this progression model over time. And I've actually started to combat some of this with having some of my clients that are open with me sharing some of their progressions over time, and showing the progressions of lab work over time within that. And there's a couple that have come to me that have been with me, 2-3 years. And we've seen that lab work progression from what they came to me upon intake with to where it's at now. And it creates a pretty good visual for combating some of this when we can also marriage the pictures alongside the lab work. So the progression of the physique over time alongside the lab work over time. And I think that that's where we need to start, like understanding that we have a lot of data on these compounds in general, but we don't have clinical data on this progression model as a whole. And so this is where we kind of start to come up with ways to combat that, create that buy-in. And that's just kind of how I've gone about it. Is I have a couple of clients that are fine with me sharing their information and just being able to use that to create that buy-in on the forefront.
I think we can all agree that anecdotally, we all have our own little experiments that we can go through. Like for myself, my lab work a week out from the show was better than some of my off seasons. So I think that in itself, like I even said to you guys, I was like, considering I'm a week out and I haven't really had that much of a break, it's not bad. So I think that's definitely, that should already give people a good idea that this is a much better way to go about things. I've actually seen my blood work progress upwards and get better. So,
and I know we can talk about health and stuff, but in the day, a lot of these people want to hear about like results and growth. And I get it. And what I dislike so much of past approaches that I've done, this like a blast and cruise, is where I jump up to over a gram plus, 1,500 milligrams. And I can only sustain that for so long until you reach some stop point, right? You pull labs, they look like shit. I have to pull back, or there's just, I just can't make progress anymore. And I pulled it all out in those first few weeks and I accumulated all the stress. And then also I'm driving up load and so quickly with that fast rate of accumulation that injuries usually stop me. So what I couldn't stand is after 12 weeks of blasting, I'm like in a shitter, right? So I have to come off because I have all this other stuff going around. Now I'm in an off season, only 12 weeks in, where I'm having to pull back for 8 weeks, get softer, drop in performance, and I'm getting poor stimulus in the gym when I'm in a lower dosage state. It's not conducive to progress at all. So what I'm offering and suggesting is like, hey, instead of 12 weeks of like go all in, then you're fucked, let's take that and extend it out for 20, 25 weeks of your whole off season. Just like Joe says, marry that to what your goal is within your training and within your whole season, to where you see all these variables continue to accumulate until that timeline that you have set out. So like for that mapping process, I plan for a year in advance. I have 14 months to Olympia. And so what does that look like moving back? Well, I need 4 to 5 months on prep. I need 2 months of downtime before I start into prep. That leaves me with about 5 months of off-season progression. Well, I want a model that I can progress over 5 months of elevating gear into that. And this is counting my 2 months post-show. So what I want to say is I want a continuous progression for 5 months versus this get some progress, then I'm, shut down and shitty, then I'm going to get some progress again and I come back down. And so if you could map that out, that's when you see the impact of being able to sustain a training and gear level long-term, and you can make more progress in that sense versus come up quick, all the problems arise, you come back down. And also not to mention the mental and psychological aspect of coming up and down, up and down. It's can be a real mind fuck, especially for a high level or even intermediate guy, even a lower level guy. Oh man, I'm making great progress. Then you have to back down because of these other variables going on. So I definitely think like for Joe's point is that, yeah, mapping out your season and then assessing where that progress was based off what you did, and then moving the dial up if you need to beyond that. And it's going to be different for the not just what level you're competing at, because you can have someone that has great genetic tool set that they never have to go up very high. And that's just right. Like you think Dexter Jackson's 50 years old, blasting 3 grams. Like, no, that's why he's been in the game so long. He just gets a crazy response. So it does come down to that individual, and you're going to have even an amateur guy maybe running more than that pro guy in his model, But again, it's off the assessment and what you need in your time frame to make progress. Like for me, I'm 35. How much longer do I want to compete for? How many more Olympias do I have in me? Maybe not as many. Maybe I want to take a high risk model to make sure I max out before I pull back. Now, if I was 25, that model probably looks a lot different. Hey, you're going to be doing this for the next 12 years. You probably don't need to be too aggressive like year to year. We just keep moving you up at that rate and adjusting dosages as needed. So yeah, I think that that summary of like mapping out your year, basing around that, but also giving context that I can't say that it's going to be better outcomes, but anecdotally through clients and what I've done with myself, I think the outcomes will be better along with the extra benefit of keeping health more intact.
Yeah, I think definitely some great points there, Joe. Like we're not trying to say that, look, you don't need anything to reach a certain level. That's not what we are saying. But what we are saying is the approach of just smashing it through the wall and taking your dosages sky high is just not good. The stress that comes with it, and I'm not here talking from, any research, any studies. Here I'm talking from experience. In past, I pinpointed exactly the points at which I was doing too much. And I knew exactly where my progress actually came to a stop. And I know for a fact, this year, exactly I'm so excited about everything is because I know that the mistakes have always come from just overdoing things. And I know for a fact that can be rectified with a smarter approach, which I'm sure John will share, I will share, Luke will share, and so will Joe across all the platforms. So I think this will definitely be a bit of a breakthrough, to be honest, especially this year with the reach that we have and what we're able to present and show people. It's not just studies, because people, people they're always like, yeah, but, studies don't really apply in real life. Well, we can always say that, yeah, they might not do, certain ones might not do, but when we are actually doing it ourselves, that's a study in itself that we document ourselves. So I think that's something that cannot be dismissed, and the results cannot be dismissed either when it comes to presenting the evidence, which will be our progress. I think that's something that I definitely think is exciting to show people this year, because we can all sit here and talk about it, but when we actually put things into motion and show people, I think that will be a different ball game as well. Just to kind of put our money where our mouth is. That's the kind of British saying that, we have here. We will put our money to our mouth is and show you the way without needing, grams of MPP or grams of Tren in place. So I think that's definitely worth mentioning from my standpoint as well.
Yeah, I'll definitely prove it. That was my whole thing this off. I haven't had an off season like 2 years, man. I'm gonna prove it. And I coach myself. There's no trying to diminish my outcomes. Like, hell, I want to compete and try to win the Olympia. Like, I'm gonna do what I need to do that. So don't think I'm gonna just came back and John added a pound of muscle this year. That didn't work. Like, why would I do that? I'm gonna maximize everything I can, but within my ability to also manage health markers. And so I'll show everyone. I'll be completely transparent about it too. And if it didn't work out, well, hey, John needed more gear, and so be it. I'll assess that and move on to next year with that in place. So it's just a learning process along the way, and I will base my needs and usage around that assessment of what happens this next year. I don't know how much time y'all have, but I know we've kind of talked a lot of philosophically about things and haven't dived into some of the higher areas. Do you have time, Joe or Luke?
We actually need to get to the point, don't we?
Yeah, I was just going to bring up about, because we've talked about nandrolone and trenbolone. Any other phase-dependent compounds that you want to dive into of what you would utilize in higher level guys? Maybe orals, because that's really one we haven't even touched on.
For me, I think for experience, the one oral that I do prefer to use, and I'm sure Joe and Luke will probably agree with me, but from my perspective, especially this prep, and the only oral that I do like to utilize, I've been pushed away from even using Winstrol now, just recently as well. The only oral that I definitely see a big movement from, or a big difference from, is definitely Anavar. That is the main one. And again, that's the one that people say is the mildest. For me, Anavar is definitely by far the strongest and the one that I see benefits of the most. So I definitely think that is one oral I like to use only in preparation. And that's the one I would like to put in the latter end of prep when performance retention is something that I'm looking for. So that's pretty much the one oral that I would like to obviously implement. Apart from, I know that Joe likes Provaro, so he may actually touch on that as well. But guys, if you want to elaborate a little bit more on Anavar use, Luke, Joe, John, go ahead, guys. But that's definitely one that shoots to me straight to my mind. Other ones I have, let's face it, I've used them all, and there isn't any other oral that I would see that is worth using. As for side effects you get for one, and two, it's just not worth it in my opinion, because the one that I notice an actual difference from is only Anavar, really.
Can I throw a random one in here?
Anadrol.
Right. So Anadrol, I find.
Yeah, I like. Glad I missed that one. I'll leave take that one. I'll hide away.
Talking about like phase specific goals.
Yes.
Anadrol is quite an interesting compound for me. So if we look at like the binding affinity of Anadrol to the androgen receptor, is very, very little. It's basically not even worth talking about. However, let's just say anecdotally, I take this drug and I get, quite a pronounced response. But if it's not really doing much at the androgen receptor, I've got a few sort of hypotheticals on this, but my feelings is that it has some strong interactions at the estrogen receptor. It transcribes very much almost like a methyl estrogen kind of effect. So I've used Anadrol quite a bit this year during peak week for clients, specifically for carbohydrate loading, alongside something like Lantus. We know what estrogen does to glucose, specifically GLUT4 expression. And I find the ability for Anadrol to potentiate that loading process to be pretty incredible. And I know that's a slightly niche phase-specific deployment, because I'm literally talking about 2 days, 2 or 3 days, but a very pronounced difference, even in individuals competing in multiple shows over the competitive season, comparing one show with Anadrol over that loading period without, the ability to drive a huge degree of glycogen supercompensation is too much for me to ignore and hypothetically make sense. But I do need to make clear that, I'm not basing this on any clinical data. It's just a kind of feeling that I have based on a, what would you say, maybe an educated opinion, or at least getting close to what it does,
Do you not feel like you can manipulate that appropriately with sodium, water, carbohydrate, food?
Yeah. Yeah. You can definitely. I think there's always room for super physiological outcomes to some degree, but then also how much can you just jam into a muscle cell? I think my greatest interest comes with. I don't want to use the term partitioning ratios, because I'm not necessarily talking about like long-term muscle cell to fat partitioning, more so the acute loading process, how much ends up intramuscular and how much ends up interstitially. And fat cell space is not even worth talking about at that stage, is it, if you're truly peeled? But the outcome in terms of just that muscle cell loading alongside a basal insulin for me is phenomenal. And I would typically manipulate sodium and fluid the days following that, more so for a diuresis effect. I don't tend to touch electrolytes or fluid when glycogen loading clients. They're usually just set homeostatically quite high. But that's the only oral kind of phase specific deployment. But like you said, I'm a big fan of Anavar in terms of its safety profile, in terms of its long durations of deployment in humans. So we've got pretty predictable outcomes clinically. I think it does some interesting things in terms of lipolysis within the abdominal region. I find that research quite interesting. So potentially its ability to I mean, we can hypothesize the MOAs. I don't think they're entirely elucidated, but potentially beta-adrenergic action that we know androgens do interact with, potentially antagonism with alpha receptors, I imagine, if we're looking at these spots like the abdominal region or glute, you know, we're very familiar with these being spots that are very alpha receptor dense. So it does have some unique properties. One thing it does seem to do is drive appetite, at least clinically, but maybe not the best for prep scenarios. But at least anecdotally, I haven't heard that too much from bodybuilders. So there's a discrepancy with the evidence anyway.
And I would agree with the Anavar deployment there is like the only one I really am going along with either. And especially like digging someone towards the end, just I do see quite a bit of utility in that inclusion for the tail end of prep.
I think too, there needs to be a reason to use a drug. Because I've had guys, hey, when are we adding the Anavar in? Oh yeah, 8 weeks out. We just added it in as X weeks out. And there is a rationale there. And basically for me, when would I need something to uphold training performance that needs to be faster acting that I can't bring about with an injectable? And so usually it's this later stage of prep, you're digging hard. I don't have the time component to allow esters to accumulate, and Anavar has some unique properties regarding training performance. And so deploying that anagen, which Anavar, and specifically, I think it has a unique, which I think about Anavar is a kind of a biphasic half-life where you have this acute bump in level kind of comes down and there's this other bump, but it seems timed right prior to training. You can definitely pull out that specific performance, which I don't notice with a lot of the other orals like I do with Anavar, which what's going to hold tissue the best when you're in prep is upholding training output. And so that's why I think Anavar is great in that situation, which I'm usually seeing the later of like maybe the last 4 weeks of a prep, maybe. And rotating through different compounds, because I've used them all individually this year to really test it and see what I get what out of. Winstrol, this was in my last prep. I only used Winstrol. Comparatively, I think Anavar still pulls out more training performance, and there's no visual change that I notice as far as like, oh, now I'm hard and now I'm not. No. I've also utilized halotestin, which we do have some data on and deployed clinically. I think it is, I would say, milligram for milligram, probably slightly more toxic than Anavar. As far as what I was able to pull out wise, I still think I got more out of Anavar training wise. And as far as like, oh, well, that will make you hard. Well, again, we've already talked about they can have impact fat some, but it's not your best choice for like a fat burner. It's not going to have a vast influence. It influences the androgen-estrogen ratio, but again, estrogen's not something we need to be smashing down if we're already controlling it in other means through stack design. And then the other ways we're going to have water is likely through cortisol increase from managing fatigue is what we want in that aspect. And then also from aldosterone, which driving up with testosterone or nandrolones or compounds that are more have more proclivity within that. So to get hard from a steroid, I've already been peeled out and added them in, and it doesn't make me any harder. So I was really like, what do I need to pull out of these is uphold training performance. And between Halo and even Anavar, it still seemed like Anavar was the better choice within that prep scenario. It seems like with Halo, there is some conversion to a DHT. I don't know if it is a direct DHT or some type of altered form. Joe, you might know. Some people have that like a little bit more of a training boost that chemically might just be placebo of, hey, I'm taking an oral. I'm taking Halo before training. Sorry?
Start raging.
My hypothesis with that was that Halo would have a slightly greater binding affinity for the central nervous system, so more of a neurological impact, less tissue selective than Anavar, because Anavar is very tissue selective as a steroidal SARM. Plenty of data on that, and just anecdotally watching others' anecdotes with Halo, I've actually never used it, seems to drive that high neurological output impact that we see from other androgens. Like Mastron's a very lower end example of that.
We've seen powerlifters it's a very popular compound.
Exactly. Yeah.
It could drive strength, and what is strength? Mainly the issue outcome of a central nervous system drive, right? So very likely so. But then also, like one that I said I would never use because I know how toxic it was Superdrol, which is a unique one in itself. It's almost like a methylated masteron, but doesn't act like a masteron. Didn't pull any more fullness that I was trying to get out of it. My labs were the worst they looked on it, with only 3 days of use before the show. So this is phase dependent. Like, this is the last few days of oral you can get a lot out of. So last 3 days before show, 5 to 10 milligrams of Superdrol. Didn't bring anything to fullness that I couldn't have gotten out of just increasing carbohydrate alone. Now, one thing I hadn't utilized Anadrol, because I just use a more linear approach, I would say, than Joe. So I linear load and bring carbohydrate up until I reach a fullness aspect that I can walk on stage. So I don't load and then pull back. I just bring carbohydrate up. But there is a pro and con to that as well, which you might not super max out glycogen and go on stage the fullest possible. Again, and I think Joe would even put in the caveat that the guys that he's utilized this on are skinned out, like shredded, because if you're not, well, most of the stuff probably won't matter. And maybe that extra glycogen you're holding, that could bring water extracellularly around the fat cells that are present. So likely guys that still get watery taking Anadrol, it's likely they still weren't lean enough to begin with. And then it goes back to, it's a whole other conversation of how you should be peaking anyway.
You just shouldn't. You just shouldn't.
Yeah.
If you're not, just don't do it. Yeah.
Just go out there. So I think I still fall in lines with, like, Anavar is still the main one. I haven't had personal experience using Anadrol in that context, but I've already kind of rolled out like Superdrol. I lean towards Anavar over Winstrol, and then with Halotestin. If I had a client that was very swayed about using it, that I would say that would probably be okay if we needed to deploy something. Otherwise, I think I still would lean towards Anavar for the risk profile than what it brings about within a prep. As far as an off-season phase, I think we can pull everything we need to out of injectables and keep risk low and not have to accumulate that acute stress that would lead us to having poor health outcomes where we have to pull back and we lose out on that extended growth phase that we want.
Agreed.
Right on.
I think that's definitely the one in terms of oral use. Short and sweet, to be honest, but I don't think there's that much to kind of elaborate on, is there?
No, I think much of this is, there isn't a secret weapon on something. It's as simple as that. And the people that have incredible response that just execute perfection over time end up on top. It's not generally something that you're not doing,
Yep.
Yeah, we're not diving into the experimental drugs, because we have drugs that have been established that already do things that we know what they do, and they work really well. So see guys still implementing mint or DHB or SARMs, and it's like we still have better options and safer options, in my opinion.
Options that actually yield results, not just huge side effects. I think what people do is they measure the drugs through amount of sides they get. The bigger the sides, the stronger it must be. Genuinely, I think that's the mentality.
Bear with me while I let my wife in before I end up in trouble.
John, Luke, is there anything else you want to cover, guys?
No, I think we hit it pretty well. I think one of the things you hear us consistently say is inclusion criteria or needs analysis or some sort of logical explanation as to deployment of compounds. And that's kind of where all of this lands, is like having reason behind deploying whatever you're deploying. You even heard us all say about how specific and niche the oral deployment was, right? And so unless you're within that niche, I don't think that we have the justification or the rationale to be deploying something like that. And this is where this whole model comes from, right? It's like we discuss what the typical inclusion criteria for most people across the board are. We're taking this on a case-by-case basis, and we're deploying as needed. And that's the big takeaway, is like, just run that needs analysis, make sure you're within your inclusion criteria, and then deploy, gauge response, and modify.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a great sum up. Luke, Joe, do you want to sum up the podcast, gents, from your perspective?
I think we covered androgens really well in here. We gave people a practical guidance on milligram per kilogram. Potentially, if we could meet and do growth hormone, and potentially if we can meet and we could do insulin, I think that would be good. And if I could summarize androgens, in a growth phase, take your testosterone as high as you can tolerate. Fill the rest up with primo. It's that simple, in my opinion. Work to milligram per kilograms within your requirements and or a risk that you accept. More drugs are going to add more muscle up to a point where oxidative stress overtakes the adaptive process of muscle growth. So, if you're exceeding that 15 milligram per kilogram, you probably do something else if you're still not achieving the kind of outcomes that you want. Or fix you. This is, with the caveat that you're training and stuff. There's a reason why I don't do that.
Take up golf. Take up instead.
Yeah, well, I don't have the genetics for this thing, so I don't do that. I stick to training dogs. So, definitely at least take an input on whether the risk is worth it to you. For some people, if you're absolutely in love with trying to chase a competitive goal in bodybuilding or a physique, find what you love and let it kill you, as the phrase goes. For a prep, potentially a very low dose trenbolone at the latter end, potentially a low dose anavar as an ergogenic agent, like John mentioned. That's exactly the way that I use anavar, paired with something like caffeine. Works very, very well. Layer in some primobolan or mastron, works incredibly well. Up to those potentially top end 15 milligram per kilogram dosing over a macro cycle that for most people wouldn't like to exceed 20 weeks if you're following an accumulation. If you're doing something like John was doing, where you're sort of working at loads and then dropping them down and stuff, I think that can be far elongated. Cuba, we spoke about this on our consultation, where we're taking, what's this like here and here, and kind of going like this.
Yeah.
And saying, again, we can float in here.
Yeah, basically, don't go high and don't go dead.
Yeah.
Don't do nothing.
Yeah, you can achieve your goals within modulating within this very small framework, because over X amount of time, your androgen exposure was actually far less than working with this model. But yeah, as I say, I think growth hormone and insulin would be some good episodes to do. I've got some things to say on goal-specific use of growth hormone, although I will back up your anecdote here, John, with growth hormone use, because I think people think that's the thing. That's really that's the thing, when you get 10 units of growth, whoa, the actual hypertrophic outcomes of growth hormone is like rubbish. Like, as compared to anabolics, it relies on a hell of a lot of synergies and permissive relationships, and even then extremely lackluster. Like, one good thing it's going to do is it's pretty anti-lipogenic, so the ability to consume more food without driving fat gain is about as good as it gets with growth hormone. Yes, the local mRNA expression of IGF-1 that anabolics give you, and the kick up of IGF that growth hormone gives you, is good. But even that's rate limited, because systemic IGF-1 is a negative feedback regulator of local IGF-1. So taking more growth hormone, you end up pushing up more systemic IGF-1, and now you're in that negative feedback zone, and you're actually even getting less within a very narrow inverted U. I don't really like exceeding 6 units. For me, past that point, things just get worse. But that's something that we can cover right on another podcast. Sorry, that was a bit of a long summary, wasn't it? Sorry.
I like it. I like it. I like it.
You started diving into the growth hormone. I'm like, all right, let's go. Those doing it. So no, great conversation, guys. And just they all nailed the summary really well. It's again, like I said, we're basing this off your need, and also trying to be health mindful and just decrease risk, so we can do this for a long period of time. And that's the goal of the game in bodybuilding. It's not the sprint, it is the marathon. And I've said, like, for my first show was like, not, was it 9 years ago? Who thought I would be bodybuilding for 9 years? I didn't. And so now I need to be able to manage health along that road and share with guys that are younger than me starting out, like, hey, you have 10 years here, you have 15 years here. Let's look at that trajectory, what that looks like to get the most. So when you are a pro, you still have tools to play, and you can still, like, because you have guys that just, by the time they're already a higher amateur level, they've played all the cards and they have nowhere to go, or at least they think they don't. But that's where you have that assessment take place, maximizing all your variables, and then tailoring gear around what you need to grow in that phase that you're in. But great conversation, guys. I always like being able to chat with y'all, and appreciate all the people that do listen and tune in, and the trust that they put in us to disseminate information. And I don't take that lightly. That's a large responsibility of us as coaches and educators, that we are talking about using drugs when we are not doctors. We're speaking in hypotheticals, of course, right? Of course, entertainment purposes. Y'all in the UK, we're through podcasts, we're via UK now. We're not in the United States. So these things, maybe there's less legality issues for us here. But anyway, yeah, it's a large responsibility to disseminate that kind of information. And I highly put appreciation in the trust that all the listeners give to us. So we'll continue to dig deep in my nerd shit, so you don't have to do as much, and I can disseminate it to you guys. And also, like Kuba said, for all of us this year, the proof's in the pudding. Rubber meets the road. Put your money where your mouth is. We'll show you that this approach leads to improved outcomes and still keeps health intact.
Absolutely love this, gents. Thank you very much. Thank you for your input today, guys. This will be another blast. I'm sure people, will definitely give us a lot of love and response. So, gents, really appreciate you all. Thank you so much. I will put all the links in the description, guys, where you can find Joe, Luke, and John, with all the services, the websites, etc., where you can find all the good stuff that these guys do. So that will be included. Thank you so much, guys. I hope you enjoy the podcast, and there will be much more to come. Take care and peace.